This is a course about Christian education, and since I've spent the bulk of my adult life involved in Christian education, I feel at liberty to be frank about what I believe is essential for increasing meaning, both for students and for teachers, and at the same time affecting positive changes that will benefit the wider community, both now and down the track. First, let me emphasize that Christian education does not rest on an academic base. Of course, academics are vital, and the very nature of formal education is academic, but the foundation upon which all academic skills and abilities are to be built is virtue. Knowledge apart from virtue is vanity. And worse than that, imparting knowledge to those who are void of virtue is really a violation of good sense. As someone aptly said, the world already has enough educated fools. If you've ever had your computer hard drive crash as the result of some really brilliant virus, you know what I'm talking about. Or if you've had your identity stolen. And we've seen examples of some highly educated corporate accountants cooking the books in recent years with really devastating results. I could go on, but I'll spare you. Now, I don't want to minimize the importance of math and science or history and art. And I don't want to imply that the transfer of information is of little value. Yet, for many students and teachers, education has come to be viewed as little more than information being transferred. Our concept of schooling has been reduced to the accumulation of facts or the development of certain mental or physical skills and abilities. Many parents, teachers, students, and it seems curriculum designers have bought into the curious notion that students are educated through the development of mental skills. Well, the fact is, such students are only half educated. To see the development of mental skills and rational abilities as the primary purpose for education, while neglecting underlying virtue, is, as Noah Webster put it, essentially defective. In a letter that Webster wrote to David McClure on October 25th, 1836, Noah Webster, who, by the way, was the most influential American educator of the 18th century and the author of Webster's Dictionary, he said, "Any system of education which limits instruction to the arts and sciences and rejects the aids of religion in forming the character of citizens is essentially defective." Now, in the early days of America, schools were an extension of the church. In the 1830s, when Alexis de Tocqueville, the famous French historian, came to America to find out what made this country tick, he noted that almost all education was entrusted to the clergy. Most American schools were established by Christians for Christian purposes. With the exception of the University of Pennsylvania, every collegiate institution founded in the colonies prior to the Revolutionary War was established by some branch of the Christian church, be it Puritan or Presbyterian or Baptist or the Church of England. These collegiate institutions in the New World included Harvard and Yale, Princeton, Dartmouth, Brown, Rutgers, William and Mary, and Columbia. What's notable is that prior to the Revolutionary War, there were 9 chartered degree-granting colleges in the colonies, while in Mother England there were just 2, Cambridge and Oxford. Noah Webster was also one of the founding fathers of America, and he saw education playing a critical role in shaping the character of the American populace. He once claimed, "The education of youth should be watched with the most scrupulous attention, Education, in a great measure, forms the moral characters of men, and morals are the basis of government. Now, when Webster talks about morals, he has a specific kind of morals in mind. He has a biblically based Judeo-Christian morality in mind. He once said the Bible is that book which the benevolent Creator has furnished for the express purpose of guiding human reason in the path of safety, and the only book which can remedy or essentially mitigate the evils of a licentious world. Now, in an atmosphere where virtue is the foundation for all arts and sciences, it's really remarkable how much knowledge can be actually transferred. In an environment where students practice self-government under God, or self-control, not only can a teacher accomplish a great deal of teaching, but students can accomplish a great deal of learning. To bring this one element back into American schools would revolutionize the entire system. But it's important to understand that virtue was not a part of the early American curriculum for virtue's sake. Many early Americans, particularly the Puritans, had a compelling reason for laying virtue as a foundation for knowledge. It wasn't just to bring order to the classroom. You see, they saw a purpose for virtue that went far beyond the classroom. It was a sense of purpose in the world. It was an integral part of a holistic worldview that motivated the founders of Harvard and Yale to see both the physical and spiritual, temporal and eternal parts of creation as all parts of God's world. They saw Christ as Lord of all, both the here and now as well as the hereafter. They saw Christ sustaining both the spiritual and the material realms in heaven and on earth. Christ's designs and purpose for the temporal world of the present were meaningful and significant to them, just as Christ's designs and purpose for the eternal unseen world were significant. Now, this sort of holistic worldview is what allowed George Swinnock, the 17th century Puritan English pastor, to say, "The pious tradesman will know that his shop as well as his chapel is holy ground." This holistic view of matter and spirit, viewing both the physical and the spiritual and the temporal, the eternal, as under the governance of God, created by him and sustained by him through time, provided a driver for education in the New World. As I mentioned in the first session, Darrell Miller, the author of one of the books you're reading for this course, Life Work, spells the word holistic with a W. And as I mentioned, I like the link between the word whole and the word holistic, because the word whole, W-H-O-L-E, really carries a powerful message. The word whole has everything to do with one's ability to bring extraordinary meaning to ordinary everyday life. Whether it's the solving of arithmetic problems as a third grader, or the writing of a short story as an eighth grader, or the washing of dishes or the taking care of a pet at home. One of the great keys for bringing meaning to everyday life is the ability to connect the dots. And by that I mean the ability to see how the lifting of a shovel, or the pressing of plastic on a keyboard, or the turning of a taxicab steering wheel, as well as the solving of math problems or the writing of short stories or the washing of dishes, all connects to something larger. This connection to something bigger, something greater, something grander, if you will, motivated the teachers and the students of early Harvard and Yale. There was a connection between the physical and spiritual realities, a connection that was provided by the common creator and sustainer of both. Both realms are God's doing. Both realms are part of a universe, the seen and the unseen, the temporal and the eternal. It's all part of God's continuous work, all God's world, not only by virtue of its initial coming into being, but the continuous sustaining act of Christ's sovereign role. Now, because of this holistic view, we have to be careful about differentiating too much between the so-called natural realm and the so-called supernatural realm. Christ has a purpose for the material, temporal things that surround us on a daily basis, like water and electricity and wind and metal and radio waves and cotton and popcorn. It's all his stuff. He continuously holds it all together. I'd like to play a short video clip of a reading from Assumptions That Affect Our Lives that will help pull some of these ideas together. Nature is the result of creation, not the cause of creation. God, the personal, unlimited creator, is distinct from what he has made, and the two are not to be equated or confused. Nature is dependent upon him for its very existence, and has been subject to his authority right from the start. Nature is not its own master. It did not appear on the scene until God said, "Let there be," and it will not disappear until he says, "Let there not be." God holds it all together by his presently active, sustaining power. And when we look at creation, a much better word for nature, we must not take it all for granted. It isn't just there, and it doesn't just continue to be there either. It originally came into being through the premeditated act of God in the first place. And the very fact that creation continues to exist today is as much of a wonder as its first appearance. We must not view creation as merely a one-time act of the past, but as a continuing deed of the present. It is not as though God made all of creation at some point in the past, and now it functions quite well on its own. God did not create a cosmic wristwatch way back when and put a self-charging battery in it and set it off to tick through time, complete in and of itself, running according to so-called natural laws. Look out your window once again. The present is as magnificent as the beginning, the very continuing existence of the universe as awesome as its first appearance. In this respect, then, we can say nature itself is unnatural. That is, if it were not for the continuing supernatural action of the creation-sustaining God, who keeps on holding it all together, nature would be no more. In terms of how most people think about the natural and the supernatural, the natural has come to mean the normal operation of a self-governing system, while the supernatural refers to the interference of God in that system. Now, this concept is unbiblical. Colossians 1:16 and 17 tells us, "For by him," that is, by Christ, "all things were created that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things consist or hold together." Yes, there is a distinction between that which is temporal and that which is eternal. Eternal things are not affected by time. Temporal things are temporary. They don't go on forever and ever. Whether it's a Ford or a Chevy or a Rolls Royce, they all end up in the same place, and no, they don't go to car heaven. Even the lilies of the field, Christ said, are arrayed more beautifully than King Solomon in all his glory, but they wither and they pass away. Yet the word of God abides forever. One lasts for a season, while the other for eternity. But although the distinction is there between the temporal and the eternal, the physical and the spiritual, The Bible does not devalue or denigrate the physical temporal world. On the contrary, the physical world is something God declared in the beginning to be good. And even in its fallen condition, creation is full of God's glory from sea to sky. He has a continuing purpose for it, even in its broken, fallen state. The founders of Harvard and Yale saw in Genesis a universe. In terms of God's active, sustaining role, there is no gap between so-called natural and supernatural things, whether it's rising bread at the local bakery or raising Lazarus from the dead. God is operative in both. While the one event takes place in a customary or ordinary manner, and the other takes place in an unusual or out of the ordinary way, God is active in both. And this brings us to the basic question of how to define the word nature. When many people use the word nature, they do indeed mean a self-creating, self-sustaining force that operates by inherent powers of matter, independent of a supreme intelligent author. Today, we hear about the laws of nature, while the part about nature's God has been dropped from our vocabulary. The notion that nature functions by its own self-created power as a law unto itself is not a new idea. In fact, it's a very old idea, going back to 600 BC in ancient Greece.
We will go back to about 600 BC, to a part of ancient Greece called Ionia, which was situated along the west coast of present-day Turkey. It was here, under the guiding hand of a man named Thales, that Western philosophy was born. Thales is sometimes called the father of Western philosophy, and when the Greeks came to name their so-called 7 wise men, they named Thales first. By changing a few basic assumptions about life, Thales and his followers, known as nature philosophers, developed a new and radical way of viewing the world. What made their way of thinking so remarkable was that they were the first people we know of to dismiss any and all supernatural elements from their concept of reality. While other people were worshiping spirits, bowing down to idols made of stick and stone, or calling upon Olympian gods to help them, the Ionian nature philosophers simply claimed that all that exists is nature, period. In their view of reality, there were no supernatural gods or God, no spirits, or no entity of higher power above and beyond nature itself. This was nature with a capital N. Nature was seen as a powerful, self-generating, self-perpetuating force. Yet it was a non-personal power, having no reasoning functions, no language, no will, no emotion, and operating by pure, blind fate. With this idea, secular thought was born. This is where it was first assumed that neither gods, small g, nor God, capital G, were necessary.
Anaximander, the student of Thales, said the first living things developed in water. Covered with a hard skin, in time, he said, they washed up on the banks where they were baked by the sun. He said that after a while, the tough outer skin cracked off and the creatures lived on. But he said man's origin came about a bit differently. Yes, he said, we too came from the sea, but it would have been impossible for humans to have survived if they had begun like they are now, for humans have a long period of helpless infancy, and we require considerable amount of feeding and care before we can fend for ourselves. And Anaximander said, man sprang from a different animal, in fact, from a fish, which at first he resembled. You may have thought that Charles Darwin thought this up in the 19th century, but the idea that humans had previously been in the form of a, quote, different animal goes back to the ancient Greeks. The most famous ancient scientist of all, Aristotle, who lived about 250 years after Anaximander and about 350 years before Christ, he believed that the ape was an intermediate form of humans. And this father of the scientific method, as some call him today, classified man as an animal and distinguished him from other animals in that man was a rational animal. Aristotle also believed that life forms sprang spontaneously from non-life forms. The mysterious force of nature with a capital N fascinated Greek philosopher-scientists like Aristotle, who observed trees being drawn toward light and considered that it was a power within the material world itself that moved it to behave the way it did. Mother Nature was not at all human, nor was it personal in any way, but it certainly was an active, all-powerful, self-creating, self-sustaining energy. Now, you'll be reading more about the ancient Greeks in one of the texts that is required for this course called Assumptions That Affect Our Lives. But for now, just bear in mind that the founders of Harvard and Yale and other schools of higher learning in the New World did not subscribe to the idea that nature is its own guiding intelligence. They looked through nature to nature's God. But the Greek notion of nature with a capital N began to take root in American academia on the heels of Darwin's book on the origin of species. The ascendancy of nature with a capital N that took hold in the West, and the accompanying worldview of naturalism that came with it was not much different from the worldview of Thales and the ancient Ionians. And this view of naturalism has brought about a profound change in education and a profound change in society at large. And that's because ideas have consequences, and this is a big idea with big consequences. You see, when a society replaces the immanent yet transcendent God of the Bible with nature, capital N, this really has a dramatic effect on law, on psychology, on sociology and history and the arts and every other subject the Academy has to offer.
Since about 600 BC, many people have walked through Thales' door of naturalism. Above this door is a sign which reads, "Nature is all that is, was, or ever shall be." Indeed, if this is the case, then nature truly is the biggest thing you can think of. Those who open this door and proceed walk down the path of secularism. In so doing, they come to be at home in a contrived world where all morality and ethics are determined by mankind alone, apart from God. After all, if the supernatural person doesn't exist, there can be no sense in looking to him for guidance in this area. Without the supernatural person, what is right and what is wrong is entirely left for humans to determine for themselves, according to mere conventions of their own invention.
The rebirth of ancient paganism in the West, and the moral relativism which came with it, cannot be attributed to one individual, but it certainly got a big boost from Charles Darwin in 1859, when his famous book expounding his theory of evolution was published. The full original title was On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. This book had a deep and dramatic impact upon Western culture. It brought the theory of evolution into the mainstream of popular thought and reshaped the assumptions of the 20th century. The concept of evolution infiltrated not only the field of biology, but also the fields of law, economics, and even theology. William James carried the Darwinian revolution into the field of psychology. He worked from the assumption that moral truth is relative, always in a state of change, and never in a fixed or absolute state. Following James's assumption, truth is something which happens to an idea, ever evolving and ever in process. It is never fixed in an ultimate sense. Truth is something which continues to adapt, to fit its environment. This being the case, moral truths, which may have once been fitting to a particular social environment, may not be fitting today. Only the fittest truths survive. And if it doesn't fit, it is no longer truth. So it is in the world of postmodern moral order.
Now, we'll come back to the topic of postmodernism and moral relativism and the disappearance of universal truth in a later session. But for now, I just want to underscore how the founders of Harvard and Yale and the students who attended these schools for the first 150 years or so viewed things differently. They saw human beings as living in a universe of seen and unseen realities, physical and spiritual, held together by the common sustaining power of one Lord, Christ the Creator, a personal, living, rational, omnipresent, immanent yet transcendent, knowable God. A God with designs and purposes for the material world as well as the spiritual world, for the here and now as well as eternity to come. Furthermore, they saw God as fulfilling his purposes in both the perishable as well as the imperishable, and to imply that God's work is of value in the eternal realm, but not that important in the temporal realm, is to fall short of appreciating God's purposes for both. Darrow Miller, in the other text you're reading called Life Work, describes the split between the spiritual and the physical, the split that exists in the minds of many evangelicals today. He describes it as evangelical Gnosticism. He says this dualism is especially evident when today's Christians emphasize spiritual activities like prayer and Bible study, and they see so-called full-time ministry as the one truly satisfactory way to live out our Christian lives. Evangelical Gnosticism views the things of this physical temporal world as not really all that important, and they view work in fields that deal with government or art or the environment or justice as really less than high callings. Now, I can really relate to this because in my own background, I can remember telling my mother when I was about 12 years old that there are only two professions in life worth doing at all. One was to be a pastor and the other was to be a missionary. I do not recall my church ever telling me this outright. I just picked it up between the lines. I do recall my rationale behind making this statement. I felt that saving souls was the only work worth doing in this life. Everything else was really a waste of time. Eternity was all that mattered. And when I sang songs like "Turn your eyes upon Jesus and the things of earth will grow strangely dim," I lumped government and the environment and art and justice and public health into the things of earth category, right along with everything else that has to do with the temporal world. One of the favorite songs of my church youth group was "I'll Fly Away." Some glad morning when this life is o'er, I'll fly away like a bird flying out of a trap or a cage. Gnosticism was an early heresy that claimed the physical world was evil. This material world was something to escape. Some of the early Christians tried to mix Gnosticism with Christianity. They went so far as to deny that Christ even had a physical body. This false teaching was addressed by the Nicene Council of AD 325. While such views like denying Christ's physical body are not held by evangelicals today, the broader idea that this material, temporal world is of no real value, no real importance, is widely held. There is a tendency among many sincere evangelical Christians to elevate the eternal spiritual aspects of reality so much that they devalue or downgrade the temporal physical world of the here and now. And this, as we'll see later, is one of the natural byproducts of Greek dualism. Yet this was never a hallmark of ancient Hebrew thought. On the contrary, the Hebrews affirmed the physical world. They affirmed it with vigor. And it stood in stark contrast to the ancient Greeks. This affirming view of matter led to a positive view of work among the ancient Hebrews, including all forms of manual labor.
Unlike Plato, the ancient Hebrews did not seek escape from the present physical world. They did not devalue the physical world, nor did they dishonor physical labor. The Greek philosophers, on the other hand, degraded manual labor and looked down upon those who performed it, while honoring artists, educators, and other thinkers. Ancient Hebrews actually valued labor and did not see it as beneath their dignity at all. As a matter of fact, it was expected that the rabbis in Jesus' day would know not only Torah, the law, but would be apt at a physical trade. The famous Rabbi Hillel was a woodcutter, and the equally famous Rabbi Shammai was a carpenter. Paul, of course, was a tent maker, and Jesus himself was a carpenter. No, the Hebrews were not ashamed of physical labor. Quite the opposite. It was considered a shame for a Jewish father to not teach his son to work with his hands. The Jewish Talmud says, "Just as a man is required to teach his son Torah, so is he required to teach him a trade." It was felt that whoever did not teach his son the law and a trade would bring him up to be a fool and a thief. Physical labor in itself was not a curse brought on by sin. God instructed Adam to dress and keep the garden prior to the fall. The entrance of sin into the world made man's work more difficult, but physical labor itself was a good thing. It is interesting to note that the Hebrew word for work and worship are one and the same, avodah.
So instead of elevating the soul and downgrading the body, the ancient Hebrews sought to serve God fully in and through the body as well as the soul, not separating them, not seeing God as the one to be loved and served with the heart and mind only, but seeing him to be served with their physical strength as well. Paul said to the Roman Christians, "Present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice acceptable unto God." Plato's idea of the body being a prison house from which the soul was to escape was not part of the thinking here. Now, because the founders of Harvard and Yale and the early students attending these schools embraced a holistic view of the world and all things in it, physical and spiritual, temporal and eternal, they did not give room to this unholy bifurcation between the two realms. They were not only able to see their shop as well as their chapel as holy ground, they were able to see the solving of math problems, the building of roads, and the study of spiders as one integrated whole. Christ sustains all things, according to Colossians 1:16 and 17, and he holds all things together by the word of his power, according to Hebrews 1:3. He does this for his purpose and for his glory, whether things in heaven or things on earth. Both the spider and the angel are equally God's stuff. There's no gap between the visible and invisible aspects of Christ's creation. He's the Lord and governor of all. Now, one of the first steps in the process of bringing extraordinary meaning to ordinary, everyday work of students and teachers is to eliminate the illegitimate gap. The holistic concept of reality that came out of the Protestant Reformation provided a driver for early American education, but this driver has virtually disappeared from academia today. I'm sorry to say, even in many Christian schools. Now, I'm not suggesting that a theistic belief about creation has been lost in Christian schools. That would certainly be offensive to every Christian school teacher and administrator on the planet. But I am suggesting that a holistic concept of the physical and spiritual convergence of God's stuff that provided a compelling rationale for all human endeavors in the here and now, from fish farming to shoemaking, has effectively been disconnected from the curriculum of most Christian schools. Now, I'll share with you how this has happened and why in a later session, but for now I'd like to peel back the onion a bit more with respect to education that characterized the first couple hundred years of Harvard and Yale. Now, we can learn a lot from the history of American education. I know this course is a distance learning course through the World Wide Web, so hopefully I'll be speaking to some educators from different countries. But even if you are not an American, the information I'm about to share with you can be helpful. To get to the roots of early American education, we really have to go back to the mother country, England, to a time prior to people departing for the New World. Now, John Milton, the well-respected Puritan voice of 17th century England, who was the author of Paradise Lost, he wrote that the purpose of learning was to repair the ruins of our first parents by regaining to know God aright, and out of that knowledge to love him, to imitate him, to be like him, as we may the nearest by possessing our souls of true virtue. Now there's that word, virtue. But Milton did not see the purpose of education as something private and personal. He saw a far bigger picture. Milton's reasons for wanting students to know God aright and to love him and to become like him were very practical and down to earth. He said this, "I call therefore a complete and generous education, that which fits a man to perform justly, skillfully, and magnanimously all the offices, both private and public, of peace and war." Now, it doesn't get more all-inclusive than this. And if you cut through the Old English to what he's saying that education that is complete, or holistic, if you will, is education that equips students for vocations across the full spectrum of public and private concerns. This public and private vision for learning was carried over to the New World. The Puritans were particularly compelled by a vision to see the application of practical, biblically informed Christianity throughout the totality of society, whether it was in the home or the church or at work or in civil affairs. Harvard and Yale not only existed to prepare pastors, but also lawyers and civil servants to have the moral integrity to govern municipalities justly under God and skillfully. Education was for the training of business people to have the moral integrity to do business rightly, justly, and skillfully under God, whether it was selling shoes or planting crops, working with God's stuff to fulfill God's designs for the present, the temporal world. This was the outcome of a worldview, a holistic worldview that saw all of life under the ownership and governance of the Creator, and not to be involved in creating God-honoring culture throughout the totality of the here and now. That, for the founders of Harvard and Yale, would have been irresponsible. As far as the colonial experiment was concerned, the founders of Harvard and Yale knew that the eyes of the world were upon them. John Winthrop famously said, "We must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill." It was in the New World that they had a shot at putting a holistic worldview into practice, and they didn't want to mess it up. Harvard was founded just 16 years after the landing of the Mayflower at Plymouth Rock. In the pre-Revolutionary War years, the number of students in these schools like Harvard and Yale was relatively small, but those who were educated in these schools, they became the preeminent leaders, and this included pastors as well as civil leaders, business leaders, lawyers, and educators. No doubt the early participants in Harvard and Yale, they saw themselves as building a cathedral, not just a wall, not just earning a living. A sacred secular split was absent from their mentality. And as a result, they valued not only book learning, but bench making as well. Early students at Yale, like Jonathan Edwards, they saw God's rightful jurisdiction over all facets of law, politics, business, science, the arts, labor, and family as well as church. The role and function of education was abundantly evident. Yes, they needed pastors, but they also needed godly lawyers, politicians, diplomats, judges, doctors, economists, and carpenters who would see their ordinary, everyday work in this present life as a practical way to glorify God, co-laboring with Him in the physical world of the here and now. Yale was established in 1701 to be an institution where youth may be instructed in the arts and sciences, who through the blessing of Almighty God may be fitted for public employment, both in church and civil state. The early students of Yale were not withdrawing from this present world, but they actually sought to be actively engaged in it. People like Jonathan Edwards, one of Yale's early graduates, not only went on to share the gospel with Native Americans, and he wrote books about theology, but he also wrote papers on things like spiders. I don't know of many theologians today who write papers on spiders. What is not commonly known today is that Jonathan Edwards and his peers at early Yale were the recipients of a well-developed curriculum that nurtured and encouraged a holistic view of the world. This curriculum was called Technologia. Now I'm drawing my comments here from Technologia from the research of Dr. David Scott, who did 8 years of research on Jonathan Edwards as part of his PhD studies. In this course, you'll be reading Dr. Scott's article called A Church Without a View. Now, I'll also be drawing some comments here from a more in-depth paper by Dr. Scott called A Vision of Veritas: What Christian Scholarship Can Learn from the Puritans' Technology of Integrating Truth. Dr. Scott writes about a historical movement that took place in England and on the continent of Europe around the time of the Reformation. He calls it integrationism. It was a movement that provided the educational driver for early Harvard and Yale. This movement was developed in England through the writings of Alexander Richardson and William Ames, and it was also developed on the continent of Europe through the writings of John Alsted and John Comenius. Dr. Scott calls these men integrationists. They developed an educational methodology for the later use of the New England Puritans. Now, from the early days up through the 18th century, students at Harvard and Yale actually engaged with the Technologia. They engaged with it in class. Dr. Scott notes that the students actually memorized its theses and they had disputations on them 6 days a week. The integrationist principles were used by Harvard and Yale as a standard for graduation. Dr. Scott writes, each year before commencement, a list of propositions called theses were selected from the various subjects of study and posted for each graduating class. For example, Jonathan Edwards' baccalaureate commencement from Yale in 1720 included these from the examination categories of Technologia: logic, grammar, rhetoric, mathematics, and physics. While all students were responsible for being able to defend all the theses posted for a given year, individual students were assigned one or more specific theses to defend before the commencement audience. Now, how would you like to give a verbal defense of anything at your commencement? Dr. Scott notes this practice continued as a part of the commencements at Harvard until 1791 and at Yale until 1795. Dr. Scott goes on to say that Technologia was the philosophical core of the New England mind, through which the American Puritans sought to understand the relationship between God, the arts, and the scholar. Technologia was a way to make the connections between the subject of study, the person studying it, and the divine creator of the subject. Technologia, writes Dr. Scott, was the skill of harmonizing all these resulting academic disciplines in a circle of knowledge, or as Dr. Scott puts it, a synoptic correlation of the disciplines of the arts and sciences. The circular scheme of Technologia did not end with the arts alone. It also extended to a third level, namely the uses of the arts in human vocations. Now, this is something I want to underscore. The movement that Dr. Scott calls integrationism was not about learning for learning's sake. It was not just a way of integrating math and science and history and art, and it was not, certainly not, about imparting information. It was learning for a larger purpose, a vocational purpose. As one of the primary integrationists of that day, William Ames, wrote, it was about vocations from fish farming to cryptography. Now here's the key idea, as Dr. Scott puts it. The emphasis on use fit in nicely with the practicality of the Puritan mind, providing a philosophical foundation for the working vocation, because humankind was created in the image of the divine artist. The vocations allow the human being to participate in the ongoing divine master plan of creation. Vocation functions spiritually as a kind of performance art, a participation in God's ongoing mission for creation. Through this circular pattern of the created order, humanity can fulfill its cultural mandate, Genesis 1:26-28, and return glory back to God. This is critically important because the cultural mandate of Genesis 1 has everything to do with holistic education. It provides a significant key for increasing meaning in education. First, let me ask a basic question. Who rules planet Earth? Now, some Christians will say God does, and others will say the devil does. But Strangely enough, back in the beginning, God himself had this to say: "Let us make man in our image and according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." This is really remarkable. God tosses the ball right into our court, right from the start of the game. These are the first recorded words in the Bible of the purpose that God had in creating human beings. This was God's first commission. Now, before we go too far in our wild imaginations, we have to stop and get the picture into focus in the proper context. While God did give us a charge to rule over the earth, he did not give us license to do this in any way we please. In an ultimate sense, God is the ruler over everything. And there are basic ground rules he's given us to follow. Humans were commissioned to manage God's creation as his vice regents. And that which he spoke into existence and proclaimed to be good, he entrusted into the hands of human beings. Although God is the infinite, unlimited governor of the universe, he made a likeness of himself to be a finite governor on planet Earth. God said, "Let them have dominion." We are the only creatures given the managerial responsibilities over the earth. It's a mandate of utmost responsibility and a position of tremendous honor. This commissioned position of honor to rule over God's creation carried certain obligations. As with any appointed role of delegated authority, we are in a position of accountability to the one who gave us that authority in the first place. Anything less than this would be anarchy, with each person deciding for himself or herself what's right or wrong. But the Bible's repeatedly clear on this matter. There's only one Lord, and it's not you or me. Why God chose to govern earth through delegated authority invested in humans, the scripture doesn't make all that clear. And considering how we've managed to make such a mess of things, it's a wonder we've still got the job. But the fact remains that we were created to rule over God's world. This rule is accomplished by people of all ages in every setting you can think of in ways nearly uncountable. For a child, rulership takes place in the context of keeping a bedroom neat or caring for a pet. And in the context of education, school is all about governance. It's about governance over numbers, governance over letters and words, governance over time, governance over watercolors, and governance over a stream of air flowing through a curled up tube we call a trumpet. Now, as we grow older, our sphere of governance widens. For adults, rulership takes place in the home as well as the marketplace, whether it's expressing governance over one's front yard or the kitchen, or ruling over spheres of responsibility at the office or the factory. Everyone, with the exception of very young children, has some aspect of God's creation over which we are responsible for stewardship. And the first commission of Genesis 1 allows us to see all legitimate work on planet Earth as a response to God himself. Work at its core, whether for pay or not, whether it's the work of a third grader learning to write, or the work of a teacher in helping him or her to form letters and sentences, is a response to God's command to rule. Whether it's governance over pencils and paper or ideas, or governance over cows and cotton and carrots, governance over radio waves and electrical currents and wind, governance over computer keyboards or fiber optics or digital images, governance over cities, governance over things, governance over ideas. Chuck Colson summed it up this way: on the sixth day, God created human beings and ordered them to pick up where he left off. Now, creation tending is a very big job. Ruling over the material realm of God's creation is a responsibility as broad as the world is wide, and it requires many varied occupations, including civil service and high-tech work and homemaking. It involves physical work, as with Adam, the landscaper, tending and keeping the garden, and it involves mental work, as with Adam, the zoologist, naming the animals. Both kinds of work occurred before the entrance of sin into God's world. Work is not a curse. The Bible tells us God works. How can work be a curse if it's something God does? It's our privilege as God's vice-regents to rule over this planet we call Earth, even in its broken condition. We are made in the likeness and image of God so that we can carry out this function. The curse makes our work more difficult, that's for sure, but the commission to govern over the material temporal world has never been revoked. Dr. Albert Green said it well when he said, "There's a subtle derailment which often occurs in Christian thought at the point of the fall. We tend to think that when man sinned, God simply relinquished the whole creation as a botched job and left Satan to do what he wanted with it. Nothing could be further from the truth. The world and all it contains is as much God's after the fall as before the fall. He made it, he continually holds it together, and he owns it all. The fall did not alter that. In Psalm 50, 10 through 12, God says, "For every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know every bird of the mountains, and everything that moves in the field is mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world is mine, and all it contains." Psalm 24:1 says, "The earth is the Lord's, and all it contains, the world and those who dwell therein." Although the devil may act like he owns the earth, he simply does not. The truth of God's ownership and his continuing lordship over all the earth, that remains true in spite of humanity's choice to act contrary to his authority. Even though the creature may say to the Creator, "I choose to ignore you and go my own way," it does not alter the fact that the Creator is still King. He's Lord of all, whether we acknowledge him as such or not. Of course, it's up to us to recognize him as Lord and to accept him as such, and it's up to us to receive his forgiveness of sin and to be restored into fellowship with him. But the fact is, Jesus is Lord of heaven and earth right now, whether anyone recognizes it or not. Now, what the writers of Technologia seem to understand so well was that because Jesus is Lord of all, and he sustains both the spiritual and the material realms, we simply cannot divide the world into sacred and secular compartments. We can't tag some work as secular and other work as sacred. In a holistic view, there is no secular world. That's because the entire realm of creation is his turf. From the plastic on our computer keyboards to the rubber tires on our cars, it all belongs to God, the Creator, Sustainer, and he's head over all. I'll expand on this in the next session. God is constantly speaking to us through his creation in a language without words. And what we are seeing and hearing in creation, or what we ought to see and hear, is that sort of ongoing reverberation, so to speak, of God's voice, his command to let there be. Now that's a pretty awesome thought, that God's voice can be heard right now all around us through creation. And Romans 1 tells us that we're all without excuse. He's speaking to every single one of us every day. The early church saw creation as a book that speaks of God, a talking book, if you will. And if God is speaking to us, the proper thing for us to do, and the reasonable thing for us to do, is to respond. It's just plain polite to respond when someone speaks to us. The biblical worldview sees creation in a way that's really unique. It doesn't view creation as something to be worshipped. It doesn't view creation as divine. And yet creation is something that invokes worship. That is, it ought to. It's a constant invocation, so to speak, to worship and to serve the one who's speaking to us.